This is Histories, where every story begins from high. Today we will read the story from our subscriber. This story based on real events that happened in Chicago, 1893. The name of this event is Shadows of the White City. I arrived in Chicago on a crisp April morning, the kind of day where the promise of spring hung in the air, mingled with the smoky scent of a city in the throes of transformation. The World's Fair was the talk of the nation, and Chicago, the White City, they called it, was its beating heart. As the train pulled into Union Station, I couldn't help but marvel at the gleaming skyline, a testament to human ambition. This was a city of dreams, but I would soon learn it was also a city of shadows. Stepping off the train, I adjusted my hat and smoothed my coat, worn but serviceable. My uniform, newly issued, was tucked neatly in my suitcase. Today marked the start of my new life as a patrolman with the Chicago Police Department. It was my first real post since graduating from the academy back in Ohio, and I was eager to prove myself. The precinct was bustling when I arrived, a hive of activity as officers moved about, discussing everything from pickpockets at the fairgrounds to missing persons cases that seemed to grow by the day. Captain Doyle, a stout man with a thick mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted me with a brisk nod. "You're the new recruit, Cartwright?" he asked, eyeing me up and down. "Fresh meat." "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ready to get to work." He handed me a badge and a nightstick. "You'll start on patrol tonight. Fairgrounds perimeter. It's chaos out there with all the visitors coming in. Keep your eyes open." "Understood, sir," I said, though my stomach tightened. The fairgrounds sounded thrilling, but the captain's tone suggested it was anything but glamorous. By dusk, I was walking my assigned beat along the outskirts of Jackson Park. The air was electric, filled with the buzz of conversation, the laughter of children, and the distant hum of the Ferris wheel, an engineering marvel that towered over the fairgrounds like a giant, watchful eye. Gas lamps flickered to life as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the cobblestones. I passed vendors selling roasted chestnuts and artists sketching portraits for tourists. A pair of street performers drew a crowd with their acrobatics, and for a moment, I was captivated by the sheer liveliness of it all. But then I noticed something odd. A young woman, dressed in a fine but modest gown, was walking quickly, glancing over her shoulder as though someone were following her. She turned down a narrow alleyway, her figure swallowed by the growing darkness. I hesitated. My training told me to investigate, but this was my first day on the job. Was I reading too much into a harmless situation? Before I could decide, a man appeared at the alley's entrance. Tall, with a sharp face partially obscured by the brim of his hat, he lingered for a moment, then slipped into the shadows after her. My instincts kicked in. I followed, gripping my nightstick tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. The alley was eerily silent, save for the echo of my boots on the damp pavement. Gaslight barely reached this far, leaving the path ahead cloaked in darkness. "Miss," I called out, my voice steady but cautious. "Is everything all right?" No answer. As I stepped deeper into the alley, the faint sound of a door creaking caught my ear. To my left, a small, unassuming entrance stood ajar. I approached, my pulse quickening. The building was nondescript, its windows dark and its walls stained with soot. A faint, metallic smell wafted from inside. Pushing the door open, I entered, squinting as my eyes adjusted to the gloom. The air was heavy, oppressive. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with strange tools and jars of unknown substances. In the corner, a staircase spiraled upward, its wooden steps creaking ominously under my weight. "Police," I called out, my voice firm now. "Show yourself." Still, no response. The feeling of unease grew as I climbed. At the top of the stairs, a door loomed, slightly ajar. From within came the faint sound of footsteps, deliberate, measured. I pushed the door open, nightstick raised, ready to face whatever lay beyond. What I saw froze me in place. The room was sparse, its only furnishings a desk and a chair. On the desk lay a ledger, its pages filled with names, scores of them, some crossed out, others underlined. But what caught my eye was the figure standing by the window, silhouetted against the faint glow of the city lights. He turned slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. "Welcome, Officer Carter," he said, his voice smooth and disarming. "I've been expecting you." That was the moment I realized my first day on the job would be one I'd never forget. Little did I know, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would test everything I thought I knew about justice, morality, and the thin line between good and evil. The precinct was quieter than I expected for a city this size. Gaslight flickered over rows of battered desks and file cabinets, their surfaces cluttered with papers and coffee mugs that had likely gone cold hours ago. I sat at one of those desks now, flipping through a stack of incident reports, trying to familiarize myself with the rhythm of Chicago's crime blotter. Fairgrounds are a pickpocket's paradise. Officer Grady, a wiry man with a thick Boston accent, muttered as he leaned over my desk. He tapped one of the reports I'd been studying. Missing persons, too. Always some tourist wandering off and losing their way. I nodded, unsure if I should share the unease I felt since my encounter in the alley. Grady straightened, gave me a knowing look, and chuckled. "First day, huh? Let me guess. Already imagining yourself cracking some big case?" "No, primer just trying to do my job." Grady smirked. "Don't lose that green energy, kid. It'll keep you sharp. For now, though, stay out of trouble. The fair's got enough problems without rookies chasing ghosts." By the time my shift began that evening, the city had transformed. The streets around Jackson Park were alive with the glow of electric lights and the hum of conversation. Tourists strolled arm in arm, their faces illuminated by the carnival-like atmosphere. Yet, beneath the festive air, I felt an undercurrent of something darker. My patrol took me past vendors hawking trinkets and food carts serving roasted chestnuts. I kept my hand near my nightstick, ready for trouble, but hoping for none. The alley from earlier haunted me, and I found my feet drifting toward it as though pulled by an unseen force. I paused at its mouth, the shadows deeper than they had been in the fading daylight. Was it paranoia, or had I heard something? A faint scuff of a shoe, a whispered word? I peered in, but saw only darkness. "Everything all right, officer?" A voice cut through my thoughts, making me jump. I turned to see a young woman, her features sharp and clever beneath the wide brim of her hat. She wore a simple dress, its hem fraying slightly, but her confidence gave her an air of elegance. A notebook and pencil peeked from her coat pocket. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, embarrassed by my startled reaction. "Just keeping an eye on things." "You look like you were keeping an ear on things, too," she said, smiling. "That alley's not much for conversation, though. Mostly whispers." I blinked, unsure how to respond. "Margaret Delaney," she said, holding out her hand, "reporter for the Chicago Tribune. But don't worry, I'm off duty tonight." "Officer Carter," I said, shaking her hand. "First day on the job." "Ah, a fresh recruit," she teased. "I'll try not to overwhelm you with my questions this time." She gestured toward the alley. "But if you want a tip, you might want to dig a little deeper into that one. A friend of mine, another reporter, was looking into it before he disappeared. Strange thing is, the Tribune barely noticed he was gone." "Disappeared?" I asked, the words sending a chill down my spine. She nodded, her expression sobering. "Thomas Hargrove. He was working on a story about the fair. Something to do with the sudden influx of missing persons. And then one day, he just stopped showing up." I looked back at the alley, the weight of her words settling on me. Before I could ask more, Margaret tipped her hat and started walking away. "Good luck, Officer Carter," she called over her shoulder. "You're going to need it." That night, I couldn't sleep. Margaret's words looped in my mind, mingling with the strange encounter from earlier. The ledger, the shadowy man, the way the air in that building had felt alive with menace. It all added up to something I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I resolved to find out more about the alley and the disappearances. I didn't know it yet, but this decision would set me on a collision course with something far darker and more twisted than I could have imagined. The precinct buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Officers swapped stories, coffee brewed thick in the corner, and the low hum of typewriters formed a rhythmic backdrop. I sat at my desk, the reports from the previous night scattered before me. But my focus was elsewhere. The name Margaret Delaney had mentioned, Thomas Hargrove, nagged at me. "Hey, Grady," I said, catching the veteran officer as he passed. "You ever hear about a reporter going missing?" "Thomas Hargrove?" Grady frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Why do you care about that?" "Just curious," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Someone mentioned it, that's all." He sighed, leaning against my desk. Hargrove was a pain in the ass, always sniffing around, poking his nose where it didn't belong. Got half the precinct in trouble with his articles. Then one day, poof, he's gone. No one's crying over it, if that's what you're asking. But wasn't there an investigation? I pressed. Grady gave me a look that said I was either brave or stupid. "Kid, people go missing in this city all the time. You can't save them all. Best focus on the ones we can find." With that, he walked off, leaving me with more questions than answers. Determined, I decided to check the archives myself. The precinct's record room was a dimly lit labyrinth of filing cabinets and yellowed papers. After an hour of searching, I found what I was looking for: a thin file labeled Hargrove, Thomas. The file was sparse. A brief report stated that Hargrove had last been seen near Jackson Park, interviewing vendors for a piece on the fair. Witnesses mentioned he'd been asking questions about a building in Englewood, a place that didn't quite fit the vibrant narrative of the World's Fair. The address was scrawled in pencil: 63rd and Wallace. By midday, I found myself standing outside the building. It was unassuming, almost forgettable amidst the bustling streets. But as I approached, the hair on my neck stood on end. The air here felt different, heavier, quieter, as though the city's usual noise couldn't penetrate this place. I hesitated before knocking. The door opened slightly, creaking as though it had been waiting for me. A man stood in the doorway, his face shadowed by a bowler hat. "Good afternoon, officer," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "How may I help you?" "Afternoon," I replied, swallowing the unease that rose in my throat. "I'm following up on a missing persons case. A reporter was seen in this area recently." "Ah," he said, stepping aside. "I do remember a gentleman like that. He came by asking questions just like you. Please come in." His smile was polite, disarming, but his eyes held something colder. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The interior of the building was peculiar. The layout seemed haphazard, with hallways leading nowhere and doors that opened into brick walls. The man, who introduced himself as Dr. H.H. Holmes, guided me through the space with ease, as though it all made perfect sense to him. "I run a modest business here," he explained, gesturing to a counter stocked with medicines and powders. "A pharmacy, though I've also rented rooms to fair visitors." "Rooms?" I asked, glancing at a staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. "Yes, quite a few," he said, his smile widening. "Would you like to see them?" Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I nodded, masking my unease. "Sure." He led me up the stairs, his footsteps light and deliberate. The second floor was a maze of narrow hallways, the air growing colder with every step. Holmes gestured toward a door at the end of the corridor. "This one has quite the view," he said. I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to lead to another dead end. Instead, the door opened into a small, bare room. A single window overlooked the street below, its glass smudged with fingerprints. "Cozy," I said, my voice strained. "Do many guests stay here?" "More than you'd think," Holmes replied, his tone unreadable. "Though some find their stay shorter than anticipated." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I turned to look at him, my hand instinctively moving toward my nightstick. He met my gaze with that same unsettling smile. "Well, officer," he said, stepping back toward the hall, "I hope this visit has been illuminating. If you ever have more questions, you know where to find me." As I left the building, my legs felt like lead. The sunlight outside was blinding, almost unreal after the darkness within. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just walked into the lion's den, and been allowed to leave only because the lion was still deciding how hungry it was. Back at the precinct, the air felt lighter, safer. The mundane bustle of officers shouting across the room, the clang of a typewriter bell, it was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of Holmes's building. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that I'd brought something of that darkness back with me. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the sparse report on Thomas Hargrove. The address of Holmes's building, 63rd and Wallace, was scrawled in pencil on the corner of the page. My fingers drummed the desk as I considered my next move. Holmes had been polite, almost welcoming, but his demeanor was too polished, too calculated. Margaret Delaney's words echoed in my head. Dig a little deeper. That evening, I found myself returning to the alley near Jackson Park. It was quieter than before, the fairgrounds bustling in the distance, but leaving this place in eerie isolation. I had no solid plan, only a gut feeling that there was something here worth uncovering. I walked slowly, scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. That's when I noticed it, a crumpled piece of paper wedged beneath a loose cobblestone. Kneeling, I pulled it free, smoothing the creases under the dim glow of a gas lamp. It was a page torn from a ledger. The handwriting was neat but hurried, listing names alongside dates. Many of the names were crossed out, the ink smeared as though by a shaking hand. At the bottom of the page was a hastily scribbled note. Englewood, 63rd and Wallace. Do not go alone. I took the ledger page straight to Margaret. She lived in a modest apartment on the city's north side, her desk perpetually cluttered with notes and half-filled coffee cups. She answered the door in a frayed housecoat, her sharp eyes widening as I held out the paper. "Where did you get this?" she asked, ushering me inside. "The alley," I said. "Near Jackson Park. Any idea what it means?" She scanned the names, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Some of these names, they're familiar. They match reports I've seen of missing women. And this," she pointed to the scrawled address. "This is Holmes's building, isn't it?" I nodded, feeling a chill creep over me. "I went there today." He gave me a tour. "Something about that place isn't right." Margaret sank into her chair, her expression grim. Thomas mentioned that address before he disappeared. He thought Holmes was connected to the disappearances somehow, but he couldn't prove it. He said the building was like a labyrinth, intentionally confusing, designed to trap people. I sat across from her, my pulse quickening. "We need to investigate. Together." She raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we break into the murder castle? You know that's what some of the locals call it, right?" "I'm suggesting we gather enough evidence to get a warrant," I corrected. "But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with." She considered this, then stood and grabbed her coat. "All right, Officer Carter. Let's see what else the shadows are hiding." Armed with lanterns and notebooks, Margaret and I began tracing connections between the names on the ledger and local reports of missing persons. The work was tedious but revealing. Each name seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. H.H. Holmes was more than just a charming businessman. He was a predator, and his building was his hunting ground. We spent hours at the city archives, piecing together Holmes's history. Property records showed that the building had been under construction for years, with contractors frequently hired and fired. The reports hinted at something unusual. Holmes had demanded secrecy, ensuring that no one knew the full scope of the structure's layout. What kind of man builds a fortress of secrets? Margaret muttered, flipping through another stack of papers. "A man with something to hide," I replied grimly. That night, as I returned to my apartment, I felt a gnawing unease. The city's usual sounds, distant laughter, the clatter of horse hooves, seemed muted, as though the shadows were listening. I locked my door tightly, double-checked the windows, and kept my nightstick within reach. Sleep eluded me. Instead, I sat at my desk, staring at the ledger page and the names it bore. I couldn't stop thinking about the women, about where they had gone, about what might have happened to them inside Holmes's walls. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if we weren't careful, Margaret and I might be next. Holmes's smile lingered in my mind, cold and calculating. He knew I was onto him. Of that, I was certain. But he wasn't afraid. He was waiting. The next morning brought grim news to the precinct. Officer Grady caught me as I stepped in, his face pale beneath the scruff of his unshaven jaw. "Carter," he said, pulling me aside. "You heard about it yet? Margaret Delaney's missing." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What? Missing? Since when?" Last seen late last night, he said, shaking his head. Some neighbor heard a struggle, but by the time anyone got there, she was gone. No sign of forced entry, but they found her coat and notebook in the alley outside her building. My hands balled into fists. Just yesterday, we'd been poring over evidence, connecting dots that pointed straight to Holmes. Now Margaret was gone, her absence feeling like an accusation. I forced myself to stay calm. Did anyone check? Yeah, Grady interrupted. Your favorite building. A few officers went over to Holmes's place this morning. He was charming as ever, said he hadn't seen or heard from her. And they believed him? Grady gave a resigned shrug. What else could they do? No evidence, no warrant. Look, Carter, I know you've got a gut feeling about this guy, but you need to be careful. We've lost good men chasing ghosts. I couldn't just sit back. Margaret was too sharp to walk into trouble blindly. If she'd gone missing, it meant Holmes was escalating, and that the clock was ticking. I spent the next few hours scouring her notes. Her apartment had been sealed off as a crime scene, but I still had copies of her work tucked hastily into my bag before we'd parted ways. Amid pages of scribbled leads and unfinished articles, one note caught my eye. Holmes has a pattern. Missing women reported near his building, often last seen talking to him or his staff. No witnesses beyond that. I flipped through more pages, finding a scrap that made my blood run cold. Key lead, basement. Why so many locked doors? No tenant access. By the time night fell, I had a plan, reckless, perhaps, but necessary. Margaret had been right. Holmes's building was key. Whatever horrors were hiding behind those walls, they'd claimed too many lives already. If I waited for bureaucratic approval, it might cost Margaret hers. I dressed in plain clothes, donning a dark overcoat to blend into the city's shadows. A lockpick kit borrowed from a colleague weighed heavily in my pocket. I'd never done anything like this before. Breaking and entering wasn't exactly covered in the academy. But desperate times called for desperate measures. As I approached Holmes's building, the gaslights lining the streets seemed dimmer, their glow swallowed by the structure's oppressive presence. The facade was dark, silent, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The side entrance yielded to my efforts, the lock clicking open with unsettling ease. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. I kept my lantern low, its flame casting eerie shadows along the narrow corridors. Every step felt like a gamble. The layout was a maddening labyrinth, with hallways that doubled back on themselves and staircases that ended abruptly. The walls were too thin in places, revealing hidden spaces beyond. In one corner, I found a small door locked with a heavy bolt. My hands shook as I worked the lock. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The basement. The air grew colder as I descended, the faint scent of damp earth mixing with something far more sinister. The basement was sprawling, with low ceilings and walls lined with shelves of bottles and tools I didn't recognize. The faint hum of machinery echoed from somewhere deeper inside. My lantern's light fell on a table in the center of the room. On it lay a tattered notebook. Margaret's. I grabbed it, flipping through pages filled with frantic notes and diagrams. One word had been scrawled repeatedly across the margins: trap. A noise behind me made me spin, the lantern swinging wildly. The shadow of a man loomed at the bottom of the stairs. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. Officer Carter, Holmes's voice drawled, calm and unhurried. He stepped into the light, his eyes glinting with amusement. And you, I must say, have an impressive amount of it. My hand went to my nightstick, but Holmes raised a hand, a pistol gleaming in it. Now, he said, his tone almost playful. Let's not ruin this moment with rash decisions. He gestured toward the room. You've come all this way. Wouldn't you like to see the rest of my work? He led me deeper into the basement, keeping the pistol trained on me. My heart pounded as I saw what lay ahead. Metal chutes descending from the floors above, rooms filled with chemical vats and strange contraptions. Holmes narrated it all with pride, his voice smooth as silk. This building, he said, is a masterpiece of efficiency. Every trap, every lock, every hidden passage, all designed to serve my purpose. And what purpose is that? I asked, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at me. He smiled, his teeth gleaming in the lantern's light. Control, Officer Carter. Control over life and death. Over fear and hope. Isn't that what we all seek? Holmes stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on me. But you already know too much, don't you? I felt the weight of Margaret's notebook in my pocket and knew I had only one chance. Holmes's icy gaze pinned me in place as his words lingered in the air. You already know too much, don't you? I tightened my grip on the nightstick at my side, every nerve screaming to act. The dim light of my lantern flickered, shadows dancing wildly across the grotesque room. The evidence was everywhere. Tools of death, remnants of lives stolen. Margaret's notebook burned in my pocket like a brand. But Holmes was calm, confident. His pistol gleamed in the faint light, and I knew that one false move would seal my fate. I don't know what you mean, I replied, trying to keep my voice even. Oh, but you do, Holmes said, his smile widening. You wouldn't be here otherwise. Curiosity brought you, officer, just like it brought your reporter friend. And curiosity is fatal. In that moment, I realized there was no negotiating with this man. He was beyond reason, his morality twisted into something unrecognizable. My hand twitched toward my lantern, an idea forming. Holmes caught the movement and raised his pistol higher. I wouldn't, if I were you, but I didn't stop. I swung the lantern with all my strength, its flame bursting as it struck the edge of the table. Glass shattered, fire licking at the oil-soaked wood and sending plumes of acrid smoke into the air. Holmes stumbled back, coughing, but his grip on the pistol never wavered. I lunged, aiming for his arm, and the crack of a gunshot rang through the basement. Pain seared through my side, but adrenaline drove me forward. I slammed into him, the pistol clattering to the floor. Holmes's strength was unnerving. He fought with precision, as though he'd done this many times before. The fire spread quickly, casting flickering light over the walls. I managed to grab the pistol, leveling it at him. Don't move, I panted, blood soaking my coat. Holmes raised his hands, his smile unbroken. Well done, officer. Truly, but you'll never stop it. Not all of it. His words chilled me, but there was no time to linger. I backed toward the staircase, the fire consuming the room behind me. This is where the novel could be divided into two parts. Part 1 focuses on Officer Carter's introduction to the world of Holmes, the escalating tension, the discovery of his crimes, and the near-deadly confrontation. It culminates in Carter's escape, battered but alive, carrying evidence and the knowledge that Holmes's evil runs deeper than anyone imagined. Part 2 would begin with Carter's recovery and determination to bring Holmes to justice. This part would delve into the larger conspiracy, Holmes's web of deceit, accomplices, and the societal forces that allowed him to operate unchecked. Margaret's fate could serve as a driving force, her survival or death revealed as a pivotal moment. The climax would be Carter's final confrontation with Holmes, either in a legal setting or another high-stakes encounter. I stumbled out into the frigid night air, the building's sinister aura replaced by the choking stench of smoke. Behind me, the flames roared, devouring the evidence I'd barely managed to save. My hand pressed against the wound in my side, my head swimming as I tried to focus. I didn't make it far before my legs gave out. Darkness crept in at the edges of my vision, and the last thing I remembered was the sound of shouting. Then silence. When I awoke, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled my nose. I was in a hospital bed, my coat folded neatly on a chair beside me. Margaret's notebook lay on top of it, a grim reminder of everything I'd uncovered. Good to see you're still with us, a familiar voice said. I turned to see Grady, his expression grim. They found you outside that fire on 63rd, he said. You're lucky to be alive. But I hope you've got something to show for it, because Holmes is still out there. Grady's words felt like a slap. Holmes was still free. The fire hadn't been enough to stop him. Worse, it might have given him the chance to vanish into the shadows, taking his horrors with him. I shifted in the bed, wincing as pain lanced through my side. What's the damage? You'll live, Grady said, leaning back against the wall. Bullet grazed you, lost some blood. Doc said you've got a guardian angel. But you'd better be ready to explain what the hell happened back there. I glanced at Margaret's notebook on the chair. It's all in there, I said. Holmes's building. What he's done. It's worse than we thought, Grady. He's been killing people, disappearing them into that place. Women, reporters, anyone who got too close. Grady frowned, his jaw tightening. And you think Margaret's in there? She was, I said, my voice cracking. I don't know if she's still alive. The next few days were a blur of recovery and relentless questioning. My superiors grilled me for details, skeptical of my claims. Without physical evidence, Holmes's traps, his basement, it was my word against his. The fire had erased most of the proof I'd uncovered, leaving only Margaret's notebook and the bruises on my body. But the notebook was enough to stir something in the precinct. Names, dates, patterns, it painted a damning picture, one that couldn't be ignored. We're putting a team together, Grady said one morning, his tone grim. We'll go back to the building. Tear it apart if we have to. I nodded, relief and dread warring within me. Holmes was clever, too clever. He knew we were coming. 2 nights later, we returned to the building, a squad of officers armed and ready. The streets were eerily quiet. The usual hum of the city dulled, as though the building itself had swallowed the sound. Holmes was gone. We found nothing but cold, empty rooms. The fire had scorched parts of the basement, but even there, it was clear Holmes had prepared for this. Papers were burned, walls stripped bare. Whatever had been hidden within those walls was gone, leaving only echoes of the horrors they'd concealed. In one corner of the basement, we found a single object, a woman's scarf stained with blood. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a chill through me. Margaret. Holmes's disappearance became a citywide sensation. Newspapers splashed his face across their front pages, dubbing him the Devil of Chicago. Tips flooded the precinct, each more outlandish than the last. He was spotted boarding a train, fleeing to Canada, hiding in plain sight among the crowds of the fair. For weeks, we chased every lead, each one leading to a dead end. Holmes was always one step ahead, his trail vanishing like smoke. But I couldn't let it go. Margaret's fate haunted me, her voice a constant echo in my mind. Dig a little deeper. Months passed, and the World's Fair came to an end. The city moved on, but I couldn't. Every case I took felt like a pale imitation of the one I couldn't solve. One night, a letter arrived at the precinct, addressed to me. The handwriting was elegant, almost playful. Dear Officer Carter, I must commend your persistence. Few have come as close as you to unraveling my work. But you should know that I am not done. Chicago is merely the beginning. Yours, Holmes. I read the letter over and over, the words searing themselves into my memory. Holmes wasn't just a monster. He was a master of manipulation, always 2 steps ahead. I knew then that the chase wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Holmes's letter was a taunt, a reminder of his ability to slip through my fingers. It became a fixture in my life, folded and tucked into the back of Margaret's notebook, a cruel emblem of unfinished business. My nights blurred into weeks as I pored over every lead. The newspaper clippings, the testimonies of former tenants, the faint whispers of people too afraid to come forward. It all painted a picture, but the edges were missing. Holmes was a phantom, a man who could charm his way into trust and vanish without a trace. Grady noticed the toll it was taking on me. Carter, you've got to let this go. You're driving yourself into the ground. I didn't answer him. How could I? Letting it go wasn't an option. Not when I could still hear Margaret's laugh, sharp and full of fire. Not when her scarf had been the only trace of her found in that hellish basement. Holmes was out there, and he would kill again. Months passed, and the city began to forget. The sensationalism of the fair faded, and with it, the urgency to find Holmes. But then, an envelope arrived at the precinct, plain, unmarked, addressed to me. Inside was a single photograph, grainy but unmistakable. A woman standing in a crowded street, her face partially obscured by shadows. My heart stopped. It was Margaret. The photograph was accompanied by a slip of paper. Philadelphia. The clock is ticking. Grady leaned over my desk, his brow furrowing. "It's a trap. I know," I said, pocketing the photograph. "And you're going anyway." I didn't answer. I arrived in Philadelphia under the guise of a holiday, my badge tucked away, and my motives my own. The city was a world apart from Chicago, its streets less chaotic but just as full of secrets. I spent days retracing the photograph's clues, speaking to strangers, and scouring newspapers for any sign of Holmes's presence. It didn't take long to find whispers of him. A doctor offering cheap lodging, a charming man hiring workers for a new venture. The stories were different, but the patterns were the same. Holmes was here. I finally saw him one evening, walking briskly down a cobblestone street. He wore the same confident stride, the same slight smirk, as though the city were his stage and everyone else merely players. I followed at a distance, my pulse racing. He ducked into a narrow alley, and for a moment, I hesitated. The memories of Chicago, the basement, the fire, the scars on my side, rushed back in vivid detail. But then I saw her. Margaret. She was leaning against a lamppost at the alley's entrance, her face pale and her frame thinner than I remembered. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide with warning, and mouthed a single word: "Run." Before I could react, the world went dark. A sharp pain exploded at the back of my head, and I crumpled to the ground. When I woke, the room was dimly lit, its walls made of rough stone. My wrists and ankles were bound, and across from me sat Holmes, his smile as sharp as ever. Margaret was nowhere in sight. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," he said, pouring himself a glass of wine, as though we were old friends. "But you've made a grave mistake." I struggled against the bindings, my head throbbing. "Where's Margaret?" "Ah, yes. Your fiery reporter friend." Holmes took a sip of wine, savoring it. "She's been quite helpful. Brave, too. But I'm afraid bravery only goes so far." The next hours became a game. Holmes taunting me with half-truths, offering riddles about Margaret's fate. He seemed to revel in my frustration, his calm demeanor never faltering. "You're not the first to try and stop me," he said, "and you won't be the last. But tell me, Officer Carter, how far are you willing to go?" It was a question I didn't have an answer for. "Not yet." Holmes paced the room as if he were lecturing in a university hall, his voice smooth and measured. "You see, Officer Carter, the true thrill isn't in the act itself, but in the anticipation. The careful construction of a narrative. Every piece must fit just so. Wouldn't you agree?" I didn't answer, focusing instead on the bindings around my wrists. The ropes were tight, but not unbreakable. He stopped in front of me, his expression one of mock concern. "Oh, don't sulk. You'll spoil the fun." I forced myself to meet his gaze. "You think you're untouchable, that no one can stop you." His smile widened. "Touché. Thus far, that seems to be the case." He leaned in closer, his breath brushing my cheek. "But I'll admit, you've been a worthy opponent. It's almost a shame this is the end." Holmes stepped away, his back turned as he reached for a polished blade on a nearby table. It was the opening I needed. With a sharp twist, I freed one hand from the bindings, the rough rope cutting into my skin. I lunged, slamming into him with all the strength I could muster. The blade clattered to the ground as we grappled, the room spinning around us. Holmes fought with precision, his movements calculated, but adrenaline drove me forward. I managed to grab the blade and pressed it against his throat. For the first time, his composure faltered. "This is over," I growled. "Is it?" he said, his smile returning. "You may stop me, but the system won't. Men like me always find a way." His words rang true, and for a moment I hesitated. A faint sound echoed from beyond the room, a muffled cry. I turned my head, and Holmes took advantage of the distraction. He twisted free, knocking the blade from my hand and bolting for the door. "Margaret!" I shouted, my voice raw. I chased after him, my legs unsteady but fueled by desperation. The corridor beyond was a maze, its walls closing in around me. Holmes's footsteps echoed ahead, but another sound guided me. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable. I found her in a small chamber, her wrists bound, her face pale but alive. Carter, she gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. I freed her quickly, pulling her into a tight embrace. I've got you. You're safe now. But the moment was short-lived. Behind us, Holmes's laughter echoed through the halls. We emerged into an open space, a courtyard lit by the faint glow of the moon. Holmes stood at the far end, a pistol in his hand. You've been a thorn in my side, Officer Carter, he said, his tone almost admiring. But every story must have an ending. I stepped in front of Margaret, my heart pounding. This ends here, Holmes, I said. Perhaps, he replied, raising the pistol. But not the way you think. A gunshot rang out, the sound shattering the silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, but the pain never came. Instead, Holmes staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Margaret stood beside me, her hands trembling, a small revolver in her grip. Holmes fell to his knees, blood staining his crisp suit. His pistol lay out of reach, his smirk replaced by a grimace of pain. You've got your monster, he said, his voice strained. Now what will you do with him? The weight of the decision bore down on me. Holmes deserved justice, his crimes exposed to the world, his victims given a voice. But part of me wanted to end it here, to ensure he could never hurt anyone again. Margaret's hand on my arm grounded me. Carter, she said softly, he needs to face what he's done. All of it. I nodded, stepping forward and snapping cuffs around his wrists. H.H. Holmes, you're under arrest. Holmes's trial became the event of the century, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. The press dubbed him the Devil of Chicago, and his name became synonymous with evil. Margaret returned to journalism, her articles exposing the flaws in a system that allowed a man like Holmes to thrive. As for me, I stayed with the force, though I carried the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of my days. Sometimes, I wondered if Holmes's final words were true, that men like him would always find a way. But then I'd think of Margaret, of the lives we saved, and I knew we had made a difference. The darkness might always be there, but so too would those willing to fight it. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. This is Histories, where every story begins with high.